So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is Romala D from Romala D Reports, and I'm here today, as you can tell, with a very distinguished guest. I'm here with Kirk Wiebe, who is a retired NSA senior intelligence analyst, and he is a current NSA whistleblower on the mass surveillance of American citizens and also innocent citizens worldwide. So welcome, Kirk. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm truly excited about this afternoon's conversation.
Romala, it's a pleasure. It's all mine, and I'm very happy to be here with you.
I'm so glad. Thank you so much for, taking me up on my offer to do an interview. And certainly it's been a long time since anyone has heard from you on this subject. And so, I mean, there is a few subjects, really related subjects, that I hope we can cover this afternoon. Perhaps we can start with this idea of mass surveillance, which you are very aware of, which you have whistleblown on. And let's talk about, the secrecy surrounding mass surveillance, perhaps, what your concerns have always been about NSA surveillance of all American citizen communications, what prompted you to speak out, and how you see the entire scenario today.
Well, let's begin with what was happening when I joined the NSA in 1975.
Okay.
If people will look up something called the Church Committee, they will discover that it was in 1975 and just before that NSA had been caught spying on Americans. The current spying is not the first time this has happened. People in control of governments often go astray and misuse their power. And we started doing that in the late 60s, early 70s, with a couple of programs designed to spy on anti-Vietnam War personnel, members of the Senate, including Senator Frank Church himself.
Oh, wow.
And Martin Luther King, many others in society. Now, I was not conscious of that fact when I entered NSA in June of 1975. Excuse me. But having subsequently studied those materials about what happened, they have simply turned the clock back prior to the intelligence reforms that led to the formation of two intelligence communities. People don't understand, I don't think, that the reason there is a Senate Select Subcommittee on Intelligence and the reason there is a House Permanent Select Committee, SISI and HPSI, on intelligence is because of actions ordered by Congress to stop the unauthorized spying on American citizens. That's why those committees exist. A lot of people assume they just exist to look at legislation affecting intelligence and so forth. No, they were established to stop the unlawful surveillance of people.
That's really interesting. So it is connected to what you're talking about, what happened in the 70s then?
Absolutely. At that time, when I entered on duty, and while this was going on, the director of NSA was Vice Admiral, U.S. Navy, Bobby Inman, one of the most distinguished, if not the most distinguished intelligence officer we have ever had at the National Security Agency, and I would even say in the federal government. Bobby Inman was a gentleman. He was a law-abiding officer. And most of all, he enforced his own allegiance, not to the president, not to the chief of the intelligence community, CIA at that time, but to the Constitution of the United States. This is critical.
Yes.
When you go in the military or when you go to work for the government, at least it used to be that we all signed oaths. We took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States.
That's right.
Not to defend a Democrat or a Republican administration, not to defend a president, a sitting president. It has nothing to do with it. It has everything to do with loyalty to the principles stated in that sacred document known as the United States Constitution. Now, as we all know, people speak about that document as something created by old white Europeans who really were old fuddy-duddies and did not know what they were doing. And so they want us to throw it out and begin anew with a new kind of socialism or fascism. And that's what I see happening before us right now. When you see the government threatening phone companies to intercept text messages, to look for people who don't want to take an experimental vaccine, that's a red flag. So we have a government, not just back in 1975 who cheated, not just back in 2001 when Bill Binney and myself and Ed Loomis and Diane Rourke of Congress blew the whistle on illegal, unconstitutional surveillance of innocent people. We have a government that is progressively seizing ever more power, and we are in danger of losing our constitutional republic and tipping the scales to a dictatorship better known as government control. And you can pick your title. You can call it fascism, you can call it socialism, you can call it communism. I don't care. The result is the same. The power moves from the people to the government. And if we are going to be a free society, it is absolutely critical that people understand these things that are happening in government in terms of their own personal future liberty and well-being. And that is at the heart of it. So I took an oath at NSA to uphold and defend the Constitution. So did Bill Binney. So did Diane Rourke as a member of Congress, as a staffer on the House Permanent Select Subcommittee. So in 2001, right after 9/11, when we found out at NSA that the contractor we had hired to keep an intelligence capability called Thin Thread and a tool that supported analytics to keep that running against foreign potential enemies, he came to us and said, Bill, Kirk, you won't believe it. They're asking me to put United States telephone communications billing data into the database for analysis. And we said, wait a minute, Randy. That was his first name. Wait a minute, Randy. That's against the law. You can't do it. And they told him, not anymore. They've got the okay to do it. The lawyers have looked at it. These are exigent circumstances, which meaning not normal because we're under threat from Al-Qaeda and these other terrorists. Therefore, it is permissible to go ahead and look at these communications. And we said, why are you looking at Americans? They're not bombing us. It's Al-Qaeda. It's terrorists. Why do you need to look at Americans? And they really couldn't answer that question.
But the orders were coming, I'm sorry, the orders were coming from somebody inside NSA.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, they came from the White House on down to do this, and the Attorney General Gonzalez at the time.
So that's where it all filtered down. And in fact, that's one of the things that I was going to kind of lead to, Kirk, because you mentioned the government has changed. The government has become very socialist and it's become very repressive. When you say the government, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about the guys in the administration, or are we talking about the NSA, the CIA, the FBI? Because I was looking at some of the information on PRISM, for instance, the PRISM program of collecting communications. And supposedly NSA was given carte blanche after 2001, around the time of the Patriot Act, etc., to collect everybody's communications, all American communications, and then run whatever filters they wished on them, and then supply this information as they pleased to the CIA and FBI.
Exactly. They've kept this under wraps for many years, and they don't want it out. The matter has never been in front of a judge in a court. All the cases are normally tossed out, although there are one or two still in the courts and still viable. One in the Third Circuit that has real potential to develop some evidence and get testimony on the floor of the court and to get a real proceeding. So we're very hopeful for that. But in the meantime, you are right. These permissions, when you say who,
right,
it really isn't one agency. Something of this magnitude has to involve the White House, members of Congress, and of course, the agencies themselves. And the agencies are part of the executive branch. So it's important to remember that their boss is the sitting president, whoever that may be. In fact, the sitting president is not only the commander-in-chief of the military, of which NSA is a component, and DIA is a component,
right?
But he is also the chief classification officer of the United States government. He decides what is classified information and what is not. And the executive order covering classification is on the White House website. Anybody can go there and look at it. And one of the things in that executive order that is prohibited is covering up a crime using classification.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's against the law. And yet it's been done repeatedly, frequently, and often to keep the truth from the American people.
So in other words, classification has been freely used right from the time period of your joining the NSA that you know of, right to the present day, as a means to cover and conceal programs, projects, experimentations on American citizens and others that several agencies want to keep hidden.
And going back to Admiral Inman, the reason I raised his name back in the 70s is because it was he who worked with Congress to develop the criteria under which NSA could or could not spy on Americans. And the only provision allowing NSA, and by extrapolation, the other agencies, although they don't operate necessarily under the same rules, the only exception was for criminal behavior. If NSA were to bump into information that an American was involved in criminal activity, they had permission to collect those communications, but they had to appear in front of a court within 30 days or they had to delete the communications. Now, so
that's no longer the case.
No, rules are created, I once was told, for very unenlightened, not really smart people. That's what you develop rules for. And often people will say, well, smart people violate them all the time. They find excuses, they find rationale on why we must circumvent a law. So there has been constant pressure to defeat those constraints and restrictions that were placed on NSA since 1975. And 9/11 provided the excuse to do it. And here's what the excuse was. What if a terrorist gets by our border patrol? What if they get by customs? What if they go live in a small town and hide in the state of Illinois? How will we ever know? Well, the short answer to that is the way you know everything else about people who are bad or criminal. You do a normal investigation of suspicious behaviors and suspicious contacts. And so that if someone comes in from overseas, you better be able to track them. If they're on a visa, you better know where they are and whether they've overstayed. Do you know, Romala, to this day, the government does not know and have a clear understanding on who is overstaying their visa and who is not.
Really?
And
It's really shocking.
Yep, the government came to Bill Binney and me at Boeing when we worked at Boeing, Advanced Information Systems, back around 2003 or 4 timeframe. They came and asked us how they could track people so that they would understand what their immigration status was if they were here on a visa, a work visa, another kind of visa. And we said, this is not hard. It is very easy to do. Guess what? The government didn't do it. Now, why didn't they do it? Too many political interests. Many people will tell you that business didn't want to do it because they wanted the workers, the benefit of the workers, and not having to deal with them under US employment regulations. So it was a cheap source of very good, smart labor from India, from you name it, Mexico, from any number of countries. So they exploited the weakness in the US government to their own personal gain. There's always money or something behind these.
That's really, really interesting and eye-opening, Kirk. Nobody probably knows this, that, you know, because everybody sees the NSA is all powerful, the FBI is all powerful, the CIA is all powerful. Everybody thinks that databases are being kept on everything, tracking everything. And certainly what you're talking about is merely a connection with immigration databases and information, right?
Exactly. And, you know, if you have reporting requirements where immigrants or visitors must check in periodically once a month or whatever, that helps it, that makes it easier. If they don't comply, then you have a suspicious character trying to hide their whereabouts, and that would be cause for an investigation. So there's lots of ways to be tipped off that have been used for decades by FBI, police, military, and police forces around the world that have successfully discovered criminal behavior without spying on everyone's communications. That's my point. They use this as an excuse to have access to everyone's communications. And then that begs the big question, why does the government want access to everyone's communications if it's all innocent?
It's absolutely mind-blowing, and I've actually seen, you know, contract requests, RFPs, requests for proposal, with the Pentagon and the Navy wanting to collect every single bit of data that's published online from anyone, everywhere.
I think that already happens.
That's already happening, yeah. So
it may not be ubiquitous, but if the government wants something, they will get it.
They will get it. And it sounds like from what you're saying, they have taken steps to get certain kinds of data. They're sort of shoveling huge amounts of data from everybody. They're storing it. We know that as well now. They're storing it for a long time. And what are they doing with it, of course, is the question, because now they have all the data that they can use against anyone for any reason if they engage in some kind of selective maneuvering of that data, I suppose, manipulation of that data.
Well, that's it. They use it selectively when and if a subject matter need arises. Someone says there's an intelligence question or an economic question, or, you know, NSA has strayed from its original purpose, which was to support military operations, to a broad spectrum of subject matter, running the complete gamut of subject matter. I mean, from science to economics to you name it, NSA's got a hand in it, producing databases full of information. They will tell you they don't look at it with the exception of a court order. And I would say, who says? How do you know they don't look at it? The intelligence community committees in Congress were established not to run the budgets of NSA and the intelligence community, but to provide oversight to make sure they were not acting illegally. That oversight is virtually non-existent. They meet a couple of times a year. They get a briefing, Congress does, and Congress asks, are you obeying the law? NSA says, yes, sir, I am. And you believe me, of course. Well, of course I believe you. And they go back to NSA and do their business. There is no real oversight. If Congress wanted real oversight, Romala and your audience, they would establish a tech team with access to the NSA TCP/IP networks. They would be able to roam on those networks, visit any databases, watch any retrieval actions, what kind of data was being retrieved and used and seen by whom, and was it being then digested and processed into a publication, an intelligence report of some kind and disseminated? And did it have information about foreign companies or American companies or legal matters where clients are being spied upon or their attorneys or whatever in cases against the government? I mean, imagine all the possibilities if you have everyone's information when you want it.
Yeah, and this sounds like you have the solution, because I was going to ask, if there is absolutely no oversight, if those House Intelligence Committees, Senate Intelligence Subcommittees are doing absolutely nothing to ensure oversight of the agencies, then perhaps this is a solution, right? Is there any likelihood of something like this happening?
No, politically, they don't want it. People don't want it. The FBI doesn't want it. Imagine an FBI 30 years ago. 30 years ago, the FBI operated like a police force, very sophisticated, and they did typical, classical gumshoe investigation. When I say gumshoe, that means sending people out to interview neighbors who surround a suspicious person, asking questions, watching where that person goes with manpower. Today, all that is unnecessary. They have complete access to the NSA database. They can go in and see what you're thinking, what things you're writing about, and they can invent causation. But then they present it in a court to make an arrest, and they don't tell the defense attorney that they got that information from NSA digital supplied information. They tell them they got it from the way we did 30 years ago. We've been talking to people and so forth. So it gets covered up. The DEA is doing this. The Drug Enforcement Agency is going into the NSA database looking for possible drug activity and then writing basically a false report, making it sound like good old-fashioned human-based investigation, walking and interviewing, that kind of thing, obtaining records legally, was the way that this case came about, when in fact it took a shortcut to save manpower. So this is the abuse that can happen with a large repository of information about the population. History teaches us, Romala, the only governments that ever want all the information about people are those governments that want to control people.
That's right, we're now within the U.S. government sphere. We're looking at multiple agencies which have massive powers and who are able to engage in activities which they can very easily conceal under classification. And I'm glad you brought the FBI up because, after 9/11, the FBI has become very prominent. If you look at some of the ACLU reports, for instance, trapped in a black box, growing terrorism watch listing in everyday policing, they have started calling people known or suspected terrorists, possible violent extremists, domestic extremists, etc. And they've been building databases which are, at this point, I think the figure in that particular report from 2016 is that there were over 272,000 people listed as known or suspected terrorists in, I think, 2008. And the ACLU thinks that the number has vastly increased by now. It's probably in the millions if this is what they're continuing to do. So that begs the question, who are they calling a terrorist? How are they going about it? Why is so many hundreds and thousands of people in these terrorist databases?
It's for this reason. They're in power and they get to decide. When Bill Binney and I and Ed Loomis and Diane Rourke were spreading the word about this mass surveillance, people would say, why should I worry? I'm not doing anything wrong.
Right.
What people did not understand, they don't get to decide what wrong is. Somebody else does.
Right.
And your belief in religion is not in good standing with their idea about religion, you are doing something wrong. If their idea of how to run a government in a more democratic way, maybe a constitutional republic, does not agree with their socialist view, then you are a problem. You are maybe even becoming a terrorist.
That's right, exactly. People who are very overly concerned with the Constitution, I believe, is one of the numbers on their list, the FBI watch list, right? If you're overly concerned about the Constitution, if you're an activist of any kind,
exactly,
you're interested in human rights, animal rights, too much concern about the environment, you're on the list.
Exactly right. And that's the danger and the threat. And it's not funny. It is deadly serious. We have seen this kind of power misused by what kind of regimes? Pol Pot? How about Nazis? How about communists? How about Mao Zedong? Look at the millions who have died with this kind of mentality of control, have killed so many.
And as you know, Kirk, because both of us are very familiar with the concept of targeting with EMF weaponry, radio frequency weaponry, neuroweaponry, etc., that many, many people around the country and around the world are reporting today. We're also looking at, well, I think we're looking at covered research, which I think whistleblowers like Gerald Sosby, FBI whistleblower, has spoken about. The FBI will pretty much turn you over to the CIA or the DOD, who's running black operations, covered military research that nobody knows about except very select groups, I guess, in the military. And the intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA with MKUltra, etc. And Robert Duncan has also whistleblown a great deal on how those programs are continuing. So people who get put on these terrorist watch lists inevitably are being trafficked into these other darker, deeper, human experimentation operations. And that brings us to the issue of what people are reporting today. People are reporting being assaulted extremely, being tortured on a 24/7 basis. And in a sense, the situation appears to have come to precisely what you're talking about. It is like, Pol Pot in action. It is like Hitler in action over here, except with stealth weaponry, with electronic concentration camps, antennas, emitters, that kind of thing.
And you're so right. So while we have taken a moment and reviewed my motivations for blowing the whistle, along with Bill and Diane and others, because of our dedication to the Constitution, we may now be terrorists. Now, here is the interesting thing. While laws have been passed to subvert our democratic foundations, right? Like the Patriot Act, those kinds of things.
Correct, yes.
They hide behind it as a Patriot Act. It's not patriotic, it's subversive to the rights of under the Constitution. But here's the other thing that's happened in our global society, to differing degrees depending on what country and what culture and the influence of religion has had. And that is this. Over the past 50 years, maybe 60 years, maybe 80 years, the point of it is, at least the Western cultures have become progressively more corrupt. What do I mean by that? I'm trying to draw a distinction between purely political orientation versus purely human behavioral orientation. They are connected, no doubt. There is a nexus. You can't split them entirely. But just for purposes of discussion, we know what's going on in the political arena, subverting our laws, finding excuses to get around the Constitution. What a lot of people have not been talking about or even reporting about is the explosion in corruption and the willingness of people to act corruptly. Now, this doubles, magnifies by an order of magnitude the licenses obtained politically, because if you're already corrupt, you don't care about laws. They're not important. You do whatever you think you need to do for whatever reason you legitimize in your own mind. And so if people are no longer constrained by their religion, no longer constrained by common threads of decency, basic principles of human behavior, of respect, and you don't steal from another. And if you're hungry, you ask for help. If you don't learn these things, imagine the poison that's created when you mix corruption with bad politicians who are willing to pass laws that are really a license to do the opposite. You have a tremendous problem, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yes,
it is. And you can pass laws, but if the people are not principled, no one will pay attention to the laws.
And the people who are not principled, in the ones in high places, are the ones who end up making these, they're doing it through legislation, they're doing it through memoranda of understanding. For instance, the one between the DOD and the DOJ in 1994 to permit the Department of Justice, which is the FBI, which is local law enforcement, to jointly develop and use non-lethal weapons, which up until that point were classified. So we're talking about, EMF weapons, etc., which are still being kept secret by these departments. They are refusing to be open about it and tell us what weapons they've got in their arsenal. So you've kind of got to dig through a lot of information before you find out what they've got and what they're using.
No, you're absolutely right. And I will tell you, the use of directed energy for weaponry as a weapon is nothing new. I mean, everyone knows we're trying to develop laser beam weapons. Right. We have been experimenting along with Russia, China, and others, the more technologically advanced countries, looking into the use of RF, radio frequency energy, for decades.
For decades, isn't it? Ever since radar was discovered way back, about 150 years ago.
Absolutely. And all of us who were young men in the military back in the 60s remember, on military bases, if you walked by a radar, an operating radar that was turning and radiating. There was a warning sign. Do not enter the beam of this radar, or you may never father a child.
Oh, wow. So they knew back then. The military has certainly known.
They knew that you
about
could,
human bioeffects.
yeah, you could at least kill the sperm generating apparatus within the male testicles, but it would also, obviously, if it will do that, it can do damage to other parts of the anatomy.
Of course, yeah.
So
And
the consequences were well understood.
they were well understood. And right now, over the 70s, 80s, 90s, there's enough public domain, military manuals, intelligence manuals, Air Force manuals to tell us that they've been studying and measuring the dosimetry manuals, for instance. They've been measuring the bioeffects. Medical physics has advanced quite a bit.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right.
So on the one hand, for instance, when you look at what's happening with, and this is perhaps a good point to talk about the so-called Havana syndrome, with how that's been portrayed in the mainstream media, with diplomats, with intelligence officials, with State Department officials in various parts of the world, in Cuba, China, etc., being hit by directed energy weapons, classified as neuroweapons, etc. And everybody's saying, oh, we don't know where it's coming from, we don't know how they're being hit. When in actuality, there's enough information, public domain information, that the militaries around the world have been developing two kinds of weapons. One is the counter material, the big, hypersonics, the laser weapons, etc., that could take out a battleship or whatever. And then there are these other bioeffect focused weapons that are to do with tracking radar, with through-wall radar, through-wall millimeter wave weapons, and the active denial weapons to induce great heat. So many others, pulsed energy projectiles, microwave pulse weapons, high-powered microwave weapons, etc.
Yeah, they're on all fronts. And look at the medical field alone. The desire to connect, if you will, through signals, the human anatomy with sensors outside the body to do diagnoses and things. And I applaud that work. But
the wireless body area networks, pacemakers and all that, you mean for people who need it, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, and it's progressed beyond that. At this point in time, it's not just people who need it they're looking at. They're looking at nanomedicine and, full body wireless sensor networks, putting nano sensors into people's bodies and brains so they can be read from a distance. I mean, you're right, the medical field, when you just look at that, it's kind of mind-boggling to what level of sophistication they've
Well, it is. And now let's add that very valid research into the thing we just talked about, corruption. The medical field is not immune from corruption. Today, if you are in a cartel and you're commanding billions of dollars, you can buy your own research team. You can buy your own lab. You can buy your own internet attack, cyber capability. You don't need governments and state governments to do this anymore. And so these technologies are getting out of control, let's say. And so the sources and the reasons why these attacks are indeed possible, whether they be on human anatomy or to hack bank accounts or make threats, should not be a surprise. We as societies are almost in a stage of falling apart. We are losing control. Don't misunderstand me when I say control. Everyone needs government. Everyone needs a system,
overarching structure or system to hold things together.
But the missing component is principle. What are our ethics going to be? What are they going to be? if you are a student of ethics, we are in a time right now that is almost blows the mind, because there are so many cross currents cutting different ways, belief systems, arguments. What's right? What's wrong? It is all up for debate, seemingly. And if we don't get a handle on this, we are going to see an element of chaos in societies globally. And the danger of a third world war are increasing, I think, on a weekly basis.
Absolutely. And there is, many people would contend, a measure of chaos endemic and evident already, given what's happened with the fusion centers since 9/11, given the sharing of information between the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, given the fact that many black operations are ongoing, weapons testing operations are ongoing, as for instance, the limited effects program demonstrates, between DARPA and NIJ, and the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, etc. So they are indeed testing, developing all kinds of sensors, and all kinds of methods of weapons detection, and even things like acoustic neuroweapons. This is openly published in this document, the Limited Effects Program report that I have written about. So you have to ask, because obviously weapons testing companies are here, weapons development companies are in play. They're the ones getting the big contracts with the DoD. So you have, and this brings up this issue of what you spoke about earlier, Kirk, this notion of corruption, this notion of politics, and also the understanding that public-private partnerships, a revolving door between government and these very companies, have sort of set up a situation now of sort of invincible power. So these guys who are developing
fascism.
It's called fascism, exactly. These guys who are developing weapons and, happily using these weapons on citizens, on US citizens inside America, and, other countries, NATO is involved as well, in Europe, etc. They're also connected to the politicians and government, and, they're able to get these positions on boards, etc.
Yes, exactly. You are absolutely right. And so it almost sounds like it's an insurmountable foe.
That's right, it does. And that's the unfortunate situation. And this is why I wanted to ask you, what do people like you who have this sort of broad-based understanding across time of how the government operates and how agencies operate, and if there's a possibility to rein some of these agencies, to bring ethics back into the picture, to bring human rights back into the picture, how is that possible to accomplish? Is it possible?
Yeah, I think it is possible, but it's going to be hard. And it's going to require that the average person change the way they behave in their day-to-day life. What I mean is, most people go through life today. Let's just say we've become very spoiled with our style of living, our relative wealth compared to the poor countries of the world. So we've become lazy, lackadaisical, and we want someone else to worry about that problem. No longer can you afford to take that position. Every American that values freedom of speech, essential freedoms, freedom of religion, freedom to gather, need to become a very loud voice. And we must begin to demonstrate instead of sitting home. I don't care if it's a plan that we all go outside and blow our automobile horns at exactly the same moment in time across 50 states. I don't care if it means we go to the Washington Beltway and we block all 6 or 8 lanes with cars going 40 miles an hour, so that by the time you go one loop around the Washington Beltway, the backup will be 36 miles long. We must demonstrate the power of the citizen. I'm not advocating buying a gun and shooting anybody. I am talking about the kind of protesting, the kind of demonstration that happened all the time in our history. People don't understand. We had groups of people screaming and yelling at politicians all the time. We had fistfights on the floor of the United States Senate. Now what do we have? We have everyone acting kumbaya. We're all getting along. We love each other. My friend, my colleague on the other side. We've lost the spirit of the battle of ideas. We don't have to come to fistfights, but we must demonstrate and demand behavior that's different than we're seeing. Our courts, I mean, everything's infected. We're not holding anyone accountable, even when you.
No, the court system doesn't seem to be working at all for the people.
No, it's not. It's not. So, at some level, it is important that each human being learned how to defend themselves. Now, that might be as simple as turning off your computer or disconnecting it when you're not using it. That just makes it harder for people to crawl up the wire your computer's connected to, called a network, and spy on you. Because if they want to do it, they can do it. So you just have to find little ways of making life easier, a little harder for them, a little easier for you, depending on what rights you value. You're just going to have to get more involved in protecting your rights, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And I love that message that you're getting across, that people independently and individually have got to wake up and recognize that your particular life, your particular family is in danger at this point in time. So everybody, as you say, has got to speak out, has got to do something. And doing these big marches and rallies, like in the days of Martin Luther King, etc., or also in the days of, just before the Iraq War. I remember I was in DC. I was in one of those big anti-war rallies. Those were huge. They didn't stop the war, but we made our feelings known by just being on the streets.
Absolutely, and we are seeing things happening, and I don't see the people reacting, and I think it's partly because they feel helpless. You're not helpless if you come together and act en masse as a group, a very large group. And we have to think of fairly harmless civil disobedience, or at least attention getters that
Absolutely.
Don't get people into trouble, but do show the power of the people.
Wanted to, that is a great idea, but I wanted to mention at this point, Kirk, that, the kind of Stasi situation that we are seeing today, where neighbors have been turned against people, against those who have been targeted. And, we have numbers of targeted around the country. And you've got these sort of Stasi actions of literally COINTELPRO harassment being directed against people. So in America, it's already become very divided and divisive. Neighbors have been pitted against neighbors.
Yes, absolutely. And it's almost, we should have been doing these demonstrations 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Right.
We're late. And you're right, those in power, because they can find corrupt people, and they know who the corrupt people are, by the way, because they spy on them. And they find weaknesses.
Yes.
They find weaknesses that they can blackmail them with.
Correct. And I've read that the FBI employs ex-convicts and, people who have something to gain by, joining hands with the feds to spy on others and snitch on others.
Absolutely. And so there is no behavior that they won't use or tool. Those of us who have been raised with principle would call it cheating. For them, it's normal behavior. Cheating is normal behavior. And that's what you're fighting. You're not fighting principled people anymore. You are fighting people who are willing to battle to the death. They want power, and they are willing to do anything to get it. So the only way we can defeat this in any country, anywhere, is through being united in our voice and demanding the changes. But there are also things that people can do. It isn't always about Washington, you know, Romola. Sometimes it's just your local school system.
Oh,
The school.
absolutely.
I mean, the
Low
school.
grassroots, speaking out, going to your local council or the school system and
Yes.
making your feelings known. I'm all for that because if you think about it, Kirk, the way in which communities have become very hostile, antagonistic places for those who are targeted, for activists, for journalists, for whistleblowers, anybody, they've at this point they're targeting, retired nurses, homemakers, targeting anybody they please because it's all very opportunistic. They're trafficking people into experimentation programs and so on. So because of that situation, that it's all over the place, would it be possible? I mean, what exactly would you say would be the best thing to do?
Well, I think you think globally, but you act locally, because it's your community and your school board, as you mentioned, those kinds of places, the small elections and so forth, where you may offer to campaign for someone. You may schedule a turn to speak at a school board meeting and begin to introduce the idea of ethics, because I think, none of us are in a position to pass laws. But what we can do is influence the need to pass laws or to adopt new policies. And so you have to appeal to people's sense of being able to manage lives together. And we lose that if we don't have a common set of principles around to structure our societies and our lives. So it might be as simple as saying we need more honest, open fora for the people to interface with the bodies who form policies of control around them, their families, their children, or whatever. We need more of that. We need more interaction. We don't need to tell a parent they only have 3 minutes to talk about an issue that requires 8 minutes to talk about.
That's what they do. They shut people down to such an extent. It's like 1 minute to talk sometimes at these city council meetings.
Yeah, and we have to demand. That's where the change begins. Little things. We're not going to tolerate or pay. And ultimately, you can refuse to pay property taxes, which means the school board will not get paid at some point. There is leverage. We just have to start small and demand reasonable steps be taken to give us a common set of principles. So I would work towards a set of agreed ethics that school boards, that town councils adopt, and I would push that first. It's kind of like legislating. You're going to champion that something be done, build a coalition, let people hear you, go give speeches once in a while. Don't worry about that your speech is perfect. Speak from the heart, speak from principle, and you will win. People aren't demanding perfect speech from anyone. They want perfect hearts, purity of heart, purity of intent, something that benefits everyone. If you appeal to those senses, you will build a coalition and people will agree with you. And if the parties that be in power, if they push back, that's not going to sit well with the people, because you're acting based on pure intent, pure principles that are good for others.
Wonderful advice. And you're basically suggesting that, people form coalitions in this way with other people.
Yes.
And that way help to push back and influence the guys who are sitting in those chairs and able to make the laws, right?
Exactly. Don't worry about Republican, Democrat, and independent. We're talking about human at the most basic level. If we cannot be honest with one another, how will we ever get along on anything?
Absolutely.
So we must demand these essential characteristics be reflected in the behavior of those who form policy and act for us in public service.
That's right. And it comes down to the local level because a lot of these programs, everything each of these agencies is able to accomplish in our communities occurs thanks to the consent of the local government.
Absolutely right.
Right. So influencing the local government toward
Yep.
greater ethicality, perhaps,
Right.
is the way forward. So, Kirk, that is actually huge advice. It's really important advice, and I'm so glad you're also calling for people to start waking up, feel a sense of urgency, feel a sense of personal responsibility, and do something. Whether it's one of these things, going and speaking out, or
Volunteer time, whatever. Sure.
organize a rally, etc. Because we've come to the point, and I think we've all seen through this COVID mania the last year exactly how governments can overreach, take power over people and push things as far as they can get. So,
Yeah. Remember, government thinks it's smarter than you are. And in most cases, it's not.
yeah.
It
So,
just is.
so it does come down to people power, individual thinking, and individual responsibilities. So that's really good note to end this conversation on. Kirk, thanks so much for your considered analysis, and you're looking across time and giving us a sense of what has happened to this country, what has happened to the government, and bringing it back down to the people, and assuring us that we individually do have the power, through our voice, our consent, and through our actions.
And so many of the false arguments held by those in power, and I can think of several right now that are being challenged by individuals, parents, and so forth, such as critical race theory.
Oh, yes.
That
Strange.
kind of thing is when you think that people in positions of power are actually passing CRT off as legitimate, it is frightening. And it's easy to take it on and win because CRT is racist. And you have to
Absolutely.
point that out. There is no legitimate reason to ever judge any human being by their external features. What you should be seeing is not something mystifying and threatening. You should be seeing beauty and humanity and respecting a person's character, at least giving them a chance to show their
Absolutely.
character.
And
So
never hold a person, accountable or culpable for the crimes of their ancestors.
exactly.
It doesn't make any sense whatsoever to, many people. And it's very wrong. And, connected with that is all of this notion of white supremacism, that ideology of supremacism, sort of, laying it at the door of anybody just by reason of their being white, of having ancestry in the Anglo-American, world. So it's kind of mind-blowing, really.
At a very young age, I took an interest in foreign cultures by virtue of my interest in a hobby called amateur radio. So when I was 11 years old, I became a licensed amateur radio operator, and I began talking to people in other countries all over the world. And it helped me to learn geography better than most Americans because I had a reason. I wanted to know where this
Sure.
person lived. I wanted to know, and I would ask them questions, and it would help me learn languages and things. So I was very outward looking, not inward looking in terms of the US. And it was a wonderful, enlightening, positive, and is to this day. I'm still doing that amateur radio 65 years later. I still,
Fabulous.
oh yeah, I still do it. And it's wonderful just to be able to talk with people.
It's the means to connect.
And I never see their skin color. It makes no difference. None. It's amazing. So please, people, anyone that tells you to judge people on color, they are coming from a place you do not want to be.
Absolutely.
It's evil.
It's,
It really is.
yeah, it's kind of crazy what's going on, the kind of ideologies that are being pushed, and they're being pushed on children too today.
Exactly.
So it's just
Exactly.
horrifying to look at and see what might happen if people don't kind of pull together and recognize you have to take a part, you have to play a part in your child's education. You can't just send the child to school now and expect that his or her mind is just getting basic education. It's not basic education anymore.
I grew up a student of the Soviet Union, and that was my primary reason for going to NSA, to fight the Cold War from an intelligence perspective. And it is why the United States Air Force sent me to learn Russian at Indiana University for 4 years when I was in the military. 4 years worth of Russian in 9 months, because
Wow.
we spoke it 8 hours a
That's
day.
been tough.
Yeah, yeah. So it reminds me that of this. The Russians always said, "He who controls the mind of youth controls the future." And it is why the Russians had children organized into groups called the pioneers. And this was their political training while going to school. And they wore red bandanas, they had little uniforms, and they made it a great patriotic affair. We call it brainwashing.
Right.
But the Russians understood that. And those of us who were very dedicated to the Constitution were not very interested in controlling the education system. And so it has fallen into the hands of people who are essentially socialists, Marxists.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we have let that happen. And that's not something you can fix overnight. So I would urge every parent to take a very active role in their child's education. And don't be afraid to go to the school board or to the principal or to the teacher if you disagree with something they are teaching that is contrary to the essential rights under the Constitution. I would begin to resist there. Do not let your children be victims of socialist thinking, because that's where they're going right now with critical race theory. They're trying to introduce it. We just had the president of the National Education Association, that large union of teachers, say, "I don't care what parents say, we're going to teach CRT to their children." She actually said, "We don't care. We're going to do this."
That's really shocking.
So there's going to be loggerheads. There's going to be clashes of some type. We have to try to keep them civil, but you must stand up and tell your school board and your principals and your teachers, no, you're not going to inject racism into the schools.
Absolutely, because it is a racism which is, it's turning the chairs over here. First it was black on white racism, white on black, and now it's black on white and white on white. Now at this point in time, so it's just a means to create further chaos. And isn't chaos part of what the communists really like?
Absolutely.
So
Never let a disagreement go to waste.
yeah, so it would come back to communism and, suppression, subjugation, keeping the people down, etc.
Exactly
So
right.
for all those reasons, really important for parents to stand up. So Kirk, great advice today. There's one more piece of advice perhaps you can give, and that's the people in this country, those who are targeted, some who call themselves targeted individuals,
Yeah.
some who just say they're being targeted and they're being victimized, being hit very, very badly with these weapons. What can these people do? Because they are sort of in a stage of extreme persecution, literally. People need to rescue them, actually, because there have been many deaths as well.
I agree with you. And I'm going to talk briefly about the larger group of people globally who claim they are targeted individuals.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you this, that many people in the targeting community perform self-diagnosis. And I'm going to tell you this, no one should try to self-diagnose. Nobody should.
Who's going to diagnose for them that they're being hit with weapons?
This is the issue. It's important that people who suspect that they are targeted seek science. Find science. Now, how do you do that? You don't self-diagnose and tell a doctor that a satellite that passes overhead every 20 minutes is hurting your ears. Don't do that. It is a critical mistake. I know it's well-intentioned, but it will not buy you anyone's ear to listen. They will immediately declare you not all there, and you will, and this happens all the time.
And this is happening already. This is,
exactly.
Doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists are frequently calling those targeted, mentally ill.
Exactly, and that's why I'm bringing this up. It's very important the way you begin to self-advocate sets the path down which you're going to go. Don't take the wrong path. Don't tell others the source of your problem. Tell them the symptoms. Tell them the symptoms and ask for help to determine what the sources of that pain, of that sensation, whatever it may be, is. If you want to broach the subject that you're aware there's experimentation out there going on by the military and others, some informed, some without permission, then fine. But do not self-diagnose in front of a professional, because most professionals have been trained in scientific method. They're very wary of subjective data. They understand it exists, but you must move from the subjective to the objective. And the only way you make that transition is to get people to listen to you. So I'm simply saying, state symptoms. Doctor, help me with this. If you can help me understand where this is coming, or these red marks, whatever it may be that's happening to you, take the path of science. You will boost your own credibility. The greater group will benefit because more scientific investigation will take place, because the science community is being cooperative with you because you aren't self-diagnosing, you're asking for help.
Well, so, and we should remember also, Kirk, unfortunately, there are complicit doctors and psychiatrists.
Oh, yes, there
are indeed working with the CIA and the DOD.
Romala, we just spent over a half an hour talking about corruption. We are well aware.
Corruption, exactly. So be aware of that. I wanted to also mention that, there are other ways you can help to establish that you are indeed being hit with some simple meters, simple electrosmog meters or EMF detection meters.
Exactly, but
take readings.
Be careful. Once you become the diagnostician, if you are not trained, you will buy into self-fulfilling prophecies. You will say, oh, look what I found. And normally these cheaper meters won't even tell you the frequency at which the emission is happening. Some of the more expensive ones will, but that's another problem. The expense of this equipment is not insignificant.
That's true, yes.
So I would vote that groups of TIs pool their resources and buy some very good equipment. And if you want to do some spectral scans of the frequency spectrum and so forth. But be aware that there are many devices in your home that create what we call spurious emissions. They're not intended, but they're a byproduct of the way a product is designed. For example, simple LED lighting devices in your home can create a lot of electrical noise. Now, it's usually ubiquitous in the spectrum, spread around. It's not finite and well-defined that you could see a spike on a meter or something. But
Right.
be aware that there's any number of sources of magnetic energy, even in your home, emanating
Absolutely.
from your TV, your radio,
Mhm.
your computer, oftentimes emits
Your
signals.
cell phone, etc.
So if you're not well versed in these things, you're not probably somebody that should do a lot of diagnostic work. So I would seek to pool resources, and then I would seek an expert in electromagnetic phenomena to actually conduct the test. And you may have to pay them $200, but pool your resources, focus your energies in scientific ways, and let's get to truth as quickly as possible, because once we build that database, I would say of multiple groups doing that, we would build a common database, share the phenomena so that a researcher like you, Romala, or anyone else could go in and look for correlations between data, frequencies, types of energy, all kinds of things. But the more we don't do that, it remains obscured, it remains dark, it remains something we can't grab a hold of and act upon. So
Yeah,
that's my
absolutely.
recommendation, is organize in a very focused way. Listen to Romala D, listen to the other people who have formal education in these kinds of activities, and we'll get there a lot faster. Let's put it that way.
I hope so. There are, that's great advice for people who actually don't know that they're being targeted and are trying to find out. And as you mentioned, Kirk, there are indeed many people who put out the kind of grandiose, idiotic information like, a satellite went overhead and it hit me. And they add to the credibility of those who are actually being targeted. They put in disinformation as well into
Yes,
the space.
yes. And that's
So
why
that is also going on.
I beg people to be a little humble, just a little humble, that enough to stay respectful of the body of knowledge of science, and seek those who are familiar with using science in the natural world to explain things. That's all my advice is.
Absolutely. And it will be wonderful if people not only can get together to get, a spectrum analyzer, frequency spectrum analyzer, because those are expensive, and
Yeah,
use those. And plus, ultimately, actually hire professionals, radio frequency professionals, engineers, who can
absolutely.
do some Faraday detection, who can figure out if people are implanted and so on. And I know there are some people doing it, but far too few. And we
Yes,
do need radiologists, we need RF engineers to step forward and help victims. So
exactly. Exactly.
perhaps, yeah, so perhaps, we can, those of us who are really concerned about this can make some efforts to find such professionals. And
Absolutely. I think there's any number of people who would love to delve into this aspect of phenomena to determine just what's going on and to what extent. And
right,
I mean, it's good scientific research and it needs to be done. There's no
absolutely.
doubt these weapons exist. Let's find out really who is doing what to whom.
Exactly. And totally, we need scientists stepping forward, and we need scientists to do some of this work for us, to help work with us. And so if you know of anybody, do send them my way. And if
Oh, yeah,
anyone watching,
I wish I knew more of these
wishes
people.
to contact me, please do. Yeah.
Well,
But
and it might be that if we meet one and that person is willing to contact classmates that they went to school with years later and say, you may remember me, I'm a group looking into these phenomena that people say are harming them, and I'm looking for someone to join with me. And appeal to people in your peer group. You know,
wonderful idea. It might happen.
yeah, and it could happen. And a lot of these groups have, as you know, professional societies, and you could
That's
do
true.
you could do a talk at a seminar or something and ask for people to join. because there are definitely targeted people. I want people to understand that. I'm not trying to find reasons to get rid of targeted people. I'm looking for reasons to identify the really targeted people that can be tied to a causation, and that we can action and do something about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there'll always be a small percentage that we don't understand quite. I mean, that's the nature of science. We'll just keep studying and keep probing and trying to understand those. But in the meantime, some obvious spikes in the data will show up. And we need to take those low-hanging fruit, action them. And once you win, once you understand fully what's going on and the source of it and prosecute the source of it, my God, your following will double, triple. People will throw money at it because you're succeeding suddenly. And people will see hope like they've never seen it before. So it's very important that we do.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one route into that is the fact that many people are reporting being non-consensually implanted.
Exactly.
So that's something that actually can be done. You know, any radio imaging facility, MRI facility, should be able to detect that.
Absolutely.
So there are ways forward, I guess.
There are.
And on that note, but we do need people to step forward and assist. You know, so
agreed.
scientists, we need absolute scientists in different fields to step
Absolutely.
forward. So Kirk, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. Thank you for going across the gamut of both the truth of what's happening in the country today and what people can do about it. You know, so.
Well, Romala, it's been a pleasure, and I hope it's been worthwhile for some folks. And I look forward to focusing more, perhaps on a couple of issues with you again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I do look forward to continued conversations with you, Kirk. And anytime you feel that there is an urgency to speak to the people about issues regarding government, security, surveillance, please do contact me and we'll do another conversation.
Outstanding. Looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kirk, again. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you again very soon.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.